Hey everybody, this is Ian Shell. I am the author and the narrator of this series, Hyper-Borea. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I just wanted to say that the comment section is open, so I would love to receive feedback on this series. Please comment your likes, dislikes, comments, or compliments, criticisms. If you have any questions, that would be awesome. The like button above, you can also hit that, and that will enable more people to see the series promoted on YouTube. But you can also share the URL with anybody that you know, whether it be just messaging friends or sharing it on your timeline. In the description are a lot of helpful links. We've got my blog, which I'm posting the book for free, chapter by chapter, just as I'm doing here on YouTube. You can follow along as the release comes week by week, or the Amazon link is there too. If you want to buy the book, whether digitally or a physical copy, you can do that as well. It's way cheaper to do it digitally, so I encourage that. And finally, my Twitter's on there. If you want to communicate with me on there or engage with me on there, that's open to you as well. I really appreciate you guys, and I look forward to reading your comments. Have 'em all 117. Wounded to death have I seen a man. By the words of an evil woman, a lying tongue had bereft him of life, and all without reason of right. Samantha Woodbury looked around at all the faces of the folks taking their seats. She stirred her coffee, then took a sip. She still took pride in pushing Bob to spend more on their caffeine for meetings. People come for the community and for help. Why not add another great service? Good coffee. She remembered holding up the Folgers can and making a puke face. Bob couldn't say no. She was right. And he saw her as a daughter. Bob's family had been killed in a DUI accident. The driver? Bob. He lived with that guilt every day of his life. Instead of spiraling into a self-destructive path like he had been on already, Bob was convinced by his father to give the rest of his life to others in order to atone. So Sam, who only had Wednesday nights free between work and night school, and Bob found themselves leading this hour of Alcoholics Anonymous. The group quieted down as Bob went around the circle, passing out some paperwork and literature to the new faces. Samantha stood and spoke. Hey everyone, thanks for coming. We're going to go ahead and start while Bob finishes this round. I see a couple new faces, so let me just say that we're a pretty laid-back group. Samantha made sure to make eye contact with everybody as she spoke, and had she looked Tricia, one of the newbies, in the eye a second longer, she would have seen a flash of light come from the slatted door of the coat closet. The world came to Gilruel slowly, her vision spinning before her. She was aware of only fabric and sticks pressed into her back, and a hard surface in her face, with small streams of light horizontally giving color to her world. She heard muffled words in a foreign language, her talon-like hands, finding the object in front of her to be a door. As her senses became grounded, she felt behind her, and had her hands tangled in a coat. She was in a small closet. She took a breath, the words of the strangers becoming attuned with her. Another month meeting. There was a bordered square of slats, providing the light. The seeress manipulated one with her crooked finger until she could see, and no more. In the room was a circle of people, all seated. They were all different, from their clothes to their ages to their sex and height. Even the body language was varied. A few looked confident and open. Others had crossed appendages and darting eyes. Hello, everyone. I'm Tricia. A mousy woman, who looked as if she had been crying for some time, spoke. Quiet at first, then she became more confident. Hi, Tricia, the group greeted. I just want to thank everyone for being here. You see, I've always had a problem with alcohol. It started when I was 15, and in a boy I like. Gilruel looked beyond the woman, into a wooden stand with a large white board in a wood frame. Her ability to grasp spoken language was rather quick, but written would be a while coming. The board was dominated by what she assumed to be the banner of a secret organization she had stumbled upon. A circle in black housed a triangle with writing along each edge. In the middle of the triangle were two symbols, probably letters. I was blackout drunk at parties on weekends. Then it was blackout drunk for hump day. Then on Thursday, because tomorrow's Friday. She did a little cheer to quiet sympathetic laughter. Next thing I knew, I was drinking every day. Gilruel smiled. She counted 14 people in the circle. She looked around the room. There was only one door and no windows. The ground was carpeted, the room lit by rectangles of light embedded in the ceiling. It was all very foreign to the seeress, but she would find answers quickly. She focused her abilities, channeling her talent. She was detecting magic in the room. Nothing. The people at this pathetic meeting must have been peasants or slaves, she found herself thinking. But that didn't explain the fat ones. Mindful of the one exit to the room, the griffin-like woman of Alfheim turned the knob on the closet door and stepped into the meeting. "But here I am now," Trisha was concluding. 23 hours sober, and a full day after this meeting is over." She smiled, blushed, then was confused why only half of the group clapped, and the other half stared beyond her in concern and shock. Trisha turned and was face to face with a squat, menacing-looking old woman who was completely naked. Gilruel's wicked hands rose, thumbs finding Trisha's eyes, vine-like fingers snaking around her head. "What is she doing?" A couple of quicker thinkers stood, but it would be of no consequence. While many masters relied on ingredients, this seeress could power her magic, her dark magic, with blood. Trisha shrieked in a mixture of agony and fear. She would have the worst parts of her life flash before her eyes in a moment that for her would last what seemed like hours. To everyone else, Gilruel's hands seemed to melt Trisha's face. The skin boiled, blood and steam gushing from her orifices. The screaming continued, and blood, like water being sucked up pipes, flowing up the seeress's arms and into her mouth. Those who had stood before made for the door, but were alarmed to find it shut tight. Dark, black bile dripping from the lock. A stocky man stood, lifting up his folding chair and charged toward Trisha. Raising it, he brought it down on the hag, but it only smashed into the ground. "No, no, 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 dear. You shouldn't try to hurt your master." The man's spine was ice cold at the voice of the witch. "Obey," she spat from behind him. Before he could turn with the chair, what felt like daggers pierced his back. Those in line of sight would see Gilruel's nails digging into their friend Bob. Bob did not scream. He blinked, his arms relaxing. He blinked and his pupils expanded. With each blink they grew larger in diameter until his whole eye was black. The former alcoholic marched forward and toward another man, who was scared out of his seat. Bob, what's wrong?" The man was backpedaling towards the wall. "Bob, it's me, Steve!" Steve's voice broke in stress and fear. Bob threw a large fist, punching Steve in the temple. Steve was knocked out cold. Steve's attacker lifted him up by the arms and began dragging him to Gilruel. Meanwhile, the seeress approached the group that had been gathering at the door, attempting to leave. That would not do. She needed slaves. Samantha watched in horror as 5 people standing by the door were hit by a torrent of projectile vomit from the mouth of the naked old woman. "Was that Trisha's blood?" she gasped. The victims by the door screamed in terror and agony. They fell to their knees, some writhing on the ground. They all clutched their faces and limbs, anywhere struck by the spew that now burned their flesh. Gilruel walked between them, stabbing her fingers into their skin, their bodies stilling, then rising from the ground with blackened eyes. Samantha backed up against the whiteboard. Bob was coming toward her now, as the rest of the men in the group grabbed up stragglers and forced them closer to the witch. "Bob, no, please, Bob," she screamed as her friend of the last year wrapped a meaty hand around her arm. "No, Bob," she cried, scratching his face with her nails. The taller, husky man released her from his grip, then felt his face where she had drawn blood. He frowned, his lip curling up in disgust. He backhanded her, and Samantha was thrown into the table. She thought it would buckle her under her force, but the table stood. She placed her hands on its surface in an attempt to stand, but Bob was by her side and had the back of her head then. He lifted her face, then ripped the lid off the coffee carafe. Sam struggled, but his hold was too firm, and she feared ripping hair from her scalp. "No, Bob, no!" she screamed. He grabbed the edge of the container with his free hand and began forcing her toward the hot coffee. The steam warmed her face. She was screaming, "Bob! Bob! Bob!" The black, boiling mixture inching closer and closer. He meant to punish her for what she did. This wasn't Bob, not sweet, friendly Bob. 1,000 thoughts raced through Sam's brain, her mind's natural response to distract her from the impending, searing pain. "Enough, dear." The witch's voice was calm and even. Bob's hand stopped. He let go of Sam's hair and the carafe. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Turn her, Bob." The old woman spoke the name as if it was new to her, like an American saying a foreign food on a menu for the first time. Sam was lifted and turned to face the room, but kept on her knees. She was looking now at the whole group, besides Trisha, who lay missing half of her head next to her seat. It was unnerving, chilling. A scene that had just been chaotic and loud was now quiet and organized. Everyone's pupils had made their eyes black. The 5 who had been by the door were all disfigured. The wounded had pus and blood seeping from reddened skin, but were unfazed by what must have been terribly painful wounds. The naked woman beckoned to her with a twisted finger, her nails long and yellow if not brown. "What are you?" Samantha cried, tears streaming down her face as Bob lifted her and carried her to Gilruel, placing her again on her knees before her new master. "My dear child," she brushed the blonde hair from Sam's face, "let us see where I am." The old woman looked around the room. "And when?" She wrapped her hands around Sam's face, just as she had with Trisha, but her thumbs were now resting on Sam's forehead. She pressed her fingers into the thick bone, and Sam felt the fingers were warm, then ice cold, then hot. It felt like someone was crushing her skull with a vice then, and her eyes rolled backward, her jaw dropped, but she could not scream. Sam was now lost in her own mind, like a dream while your eyes are open. The pain was constant, images from her childhood flashing before her. All the while, the old woman's body, and her friends' stoic faces beyond, faded. She had grown up in the suburbs, was in high school for the recession. What was most striking about her memories was that they were linear for the most part, but seemed to rewind or just move on slower sometimes, like someone had a DVD of her past and was hitting pause or slow motion. The witch seemed to be in control, and what she could see of her beyond her memory visions was a twitch of her pointed chin every few moments that was in sync with the pausing and the slowing. Sam found a pattern soon. The memories she was seeing were mostly mundane. Google Maps of the area, her driving, day-to-day life and interactions. Then she was flashing back and forth between a blog post about a vacation to Sedona, red rocks, vortexes, crystal energy, a map of Arizona, a car on the highway, dinner dates with her boyfriend, a jewelry store. Sam felt the hands fall from her head. She had a splitting headache now, and felt as if she had been holding her breath underwater. She was panting, hyperventilating, then recovering. "Please," she sobbed. Then the nails were in her neck too, and her breath was lost. Her vision blurred, and she was gone. "Rise, my pretty." Gilruel stood apart from her 13 slaves. "There is only one place he will search for an artifact," she thought out loud as Sam rose, eyes black. "Sedona!" Chapter 5. Riding through your thunder to heaven and hell, a killer machine is a love that you need. You're living to ride, but you ride and die. Gamble to life on your last ride. Doc Holliday, Last Ride. It was an immaculate sunset, one I had not seen since my last nights in a desert. The radiant gold, red, orange, and finally purple and blues, a product of minute dust particles hanging in the air. It was time for an explanation as to my identity with the young, beautiful Silver. She took it well. We had returned from the market unscathed, and a confrontation erupted, the catalyst being my sampling of the frozen sweetened cheese bread from the night before. Young Silver did not believe her brother that I was, as I said. That is, until there was a demonstration. What number am I thinking? 420, I read her mind, her frown softening and her eyebrows raising. Again. 600,553. Again. Something called Uno. What the heck? More of a statement than a question from Sylvia. What else can you do? Were it not for young Saemon begging me to turn into a cat, I would have waxed long about my many abilities to impress the maiden. But the cat would do. Meow, I purred, immediately suppressing my inborn desire to rub my feline face on every surface to mark territory with my odor. This is not real. Did you drug me? She accused her brother now. No, he wants to go to Sedona to find some magic stuff. Saemon's hands were up, palms out to non-verbally cue he was hiding nothing. Sedona? Well, we have to go. We can't. Mom will kill us. We don't even have gas money. I was keen on Sylvia. She was proving to be a strong asset, smarter than her brother, and my advocate. I will provide protection from your mother, young Seaman. Sean was to respond, but he was cut off by Silver, who held a communication glass for him to view. Janice and Sedona, the sisters smirked in a sinister manner. No way. Sean grabbed the glass. After swiping his finger on it for a moment, he handed it back to her. That doesn't change anything. Oh, Sean, that's your biggest crush, and you're going to pass up on the opportunity to introduce her to a real-life wizard? You know how impressed she would be? Allow me to view the maiden in question. I took to Silver's side and glanced down. In view was a dame, far out of the league of young Seaman. She possessed a full body, tight where desired and generous elsewhere. Her eyes were that of a doe, elf in face, an agreeable smile. This must be the king's daughter. Her hair was golden. She was tall. Silver was laughing then. Sean, this is your princess. We have to go. Sean threw his hands in the air. Fine, we'll go tomorrow. Early, though. Be up at 5. I have some money I was saving to build a new gaming rig, but that can wait. I bowed low to him then. Your sacrifice of wealth and the ire of your mother will not be forgotten, Sean. After a small dinner, I felt it necessary to measure the combat skills of my team, should the need arise. Sean, Sylvia, what martial training have you mastered? Has it ever been necessary for you to defend yourselves from bandits, highwaymen, or rapists? Maybe savage desert clans? A couple of odd looks was all the answer I needed, so it was the evening, in the small yard, posterior to the home, that I shaped wood into swords and instructed the siblings. Jarvir, literally Dove-Piece, was my physical weapons instructor. The master had dedicated his life and research to being a battle master, and would probably be at King Marlon's side in the fight against Cornwall, were it not for his tragic death. For decades he had honed his abilities. He was able to, oh so subtly, cast spells that blunted the blades of enemy armies, slowed arrows, and weighed down fast horses. He tested his magics by traveling to locations where battles were to be had by warring nations. Alfmen did not care for the politics of the Southerners. This was all an experiment to Jarvir. He was good, too. At the end, he could quicken his allies' reflexes while slowing the enemies. He could heat the hilts of enemy swords so that they would drop them before being burned, and he could even make the skin of most of his soldiers invulnerable for some time against blade and blunt weapon alike. He taught me many of these spells, and with some practice, I think I could make both of you into formidable opponents. What happened to Java? Sylvia asked. It's a long story, I dismissed. Best we forget about it and start training. Wait, tell us about Java, Sean spoke now. Jarvir was his name, and he was a master, who you must respect. My nose wrinkled in annoyance. Why wouldn't these fool Greeks just listen? I crossed my arms and waited for my two pupils to return their sword arms to ready position, but they stood, staring at me like cattle. Fine, I gave in. You see, Jarvir was obsessed with swords, and he sought a famous blade in the lands beyond Alfheim, and asked for my help in finding it. The artist of battle had his entire dining hall walls covered in legendary swords acquired in quests, treasure troves, and purchased with sweat or gold. But this sword was one he had never heard tell of. He said it was a sword that did not know defeat. I decided to help. He had acquired a scroll with the prophecy of its location from some Southrunner who he had met from the far east. Though the writing was in code, I had discerned, quite cleverly I might add, that the sword was in a mountain chain far to our south and east, about halfway to the Persian road, a far distance. So we set out. Jarvir was more skilled in battle magic than shamanistic skills, so I had to spend a week imbuing feathers of a hawk with more magics so his lesser abilities could channel the form for such a long journey. Could you do that for me? Sean asked excitedly. What? Could you make a feather so that I could become a hawk? Even if I could find a hawk feather around here, the answer is no. I've only found pigeons and doves so far. That was a half-truth. What I wasn't telling Seaman was that earlier in the evening I had flown around as a dove until I found a hawk. Then I dispatched it, and now I had a carcass stuffed into my ingredients bag. A new ingredients bag, I might add, from a wonderful store called Walmart. Why not? Sylvia asked. Well, you must have the ability to cast. Master Jarvir was the equivalent to hard of hearing when it came to that sort of magic. You both are deaf. Now, may I finish my story before the sun has sunk entirely? My two apprentices nodded. The journey was many days flying with favorable winds. We found a village in the hills before the great mountain chain, and after a short display of our abilities, we had a feast with the local earl and our selection of women to warm our beds. It was a day or two scouting the mountains before we found a cave adjacent to a little-known tarn that was found by combining wording from the prophecy and the knowledge of the earl's local guides. "What's a tarn?" Sabin asked. "A mountain lake. Now shut up," Silver responded to my delight. As I was saying, I smiled. We found a cave, and after an hour of searching, we found a tunnel to an old fortress. The fortress was guarded by a wraith and an army of skeleton warriors. All were dispatched by my magical attacks and Master Jarvier's swordsmanship. It was in the throne room that we found it. Mind you, it had taken us days of searching. It's not like in your Skyrim games where the treasure is found immediately. We spent days in the dark, days without seeing light or smelling the wind. But in that throne room we found what we had traveled so far for. The battlemaster approached it, the sword that did not know defeat. It was on a stand of grey stone, like the cold walls that surrounded us inside the mountain. The light of the torches I had conjured danced across these walls, and our voices and footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness. I sighed. Jarvier removed the sword from the stand, and as he appreciated its beauty, its black jewelled hilt and curved blade, he clutched his heart and fell dead. When the sword, clattering on the ground, had finished echoing, I approached the stone stand it had rested upon. Inscribed, so that it could only be read after the sword was removed, the words said, "The only way to know no defeat is to never fight at all." You see, it was a cursed blade, and we had not been privy to the full context of the prophecy. I had warned Master Jarvier, but his lust for the blade had clouded his judgment. "What?" Samin started. "That's it?" "Yes," I smirked. "Those who curse or bless weapons often have strange senses of humor. I once crafted a blade of flatulence for a Yuletide gift for Cormal." I erupted with laughter at the memory, clutching my belly and perfectly recreating a farting noise with my mouth. I wiped a tear from my eye, and I continued. I did not remain long enough to determine if the sword that had killed my old teacher had been crafted that way, or if it was haunted. But we must return to our drills now, and so I drilled my students in swordplay for another hour. They were good sports. Despite complaining of fatigue, they did not quit. After bathing again, we all met briefly and agreed that we would discuss our plans for our expedition during the 2-hour-long voyage across over 100 miles, an endurance speed record for me. Sleep came quickly, my brain restless with the processing of so much information absorbed in such a short amount of time. I dreamed first of the neighborhoods that I had been driven through, and later flown through, so strange, so manufactured. One could not discern the natural flora or brush of the native land, given the vast landscaping efforts. Undeveloped plots for houses were combed and rooted of any life, leaving only dirt and debris. Then my mind wandered to these strange people. Thousands of years had passed since my people had lived and died. Thousands of years of trials and wars. Thousands of years had produced such a soft, fat people. Why were they this way? Is this what we worked for, day in and day out, with scientific and magical study and achievement? All for what? So our spoiled descendants could eat sweetened bread and live the life of others through glass screens. It was beautiful in a way. But now my dreams took me to another place, somewhere darker. It was a tavern of sorts, and there was blood, a lot of blood. I was standing in the center of the room, a bar to my front, a thick table with green carpet and 6 holes on top. Colorful balls with numbers painted on them were scattered about. A bald, dead man with one shoved in his mouth lay belly up. He was the only body I saw. I followed a trail of blood along the wooden floor to a pair of double doors with circular windows, blacked out in with a red sign reading "Exit." It was out into a parking lot, smaller in size compared to any of the ones I had seen or been to today. It was there that I saw her, Gil Ruel. She stared at me, through me. Beyond her was the nightfall, the desert, a long road, and a windmill. She spoke my name. Sovos. A hiss. Then I woke. It was Jim Gardner's first hour and a half of his multi-day trip. He normally took this trip with his father, but his father didn't normally have a golf tournament that was high stakes. His dad had improved in his game in retirement, and the two often joked, that he would finally go pro after his years of playing intramural in college. Jim and his father's tradition had started nearly a decade ago. Whenever they drove up to Flagstaff or Sedona from Phoenix, even if it was a day trip, they would stop at Rowdy Ron's Bar and Grill. It was the farthest thing from a chain, and calling it a mom-and-pop joint would be a crime. That was because the owner, Ron, was a big biker who looked like he had been born on a Harley, a spitting image of the actor Ron Perlman from Sons of Anarchy. Ron was inviting, friendly, and a hell of a cook. Jim and John, his dad, were in need of a couple beers and some grub after a serious hike that was advertised as light by a coworker days prior. The hike had been anything but. Tired, hungry, and dehydrated, the father and son had stopped their return trip south to get some fresh hamburgers as advertised by a handmade sign on the sign of the I-17. Jim smirked as he took another bite of his BLTA, his eyes on the door. He and his father had walked in about 10 years ago. It was later in the night then, and the place was packed with leather-studded, boot-wearing bikers. They had just about turned around and left, accountants that had never ridden a motorcycle in their lives, when Ron, himself, had turned them around and invited them in. The man's smile was so genuine and warm that they hadn't harbored second thoughts in the slightest. And the burgers, wow, they were to die for. It was on a trip a few years prior that Jim and his dad learned about the death of Ron. It was like the death of a close friend. Ron was buried behind the bar, Jim and his father paying their respects after they had heard the news for the first time. Ron was the type of owner that had remembered their faces and always knew their names and their drinks. Always asked how the food was. Jim sipped a Heineken, dispelling the melancholic views of the past, dispelling the creeping thoughts of how many emails would be in his mailbox when he got back to work. He thought now of Zion National Park, and the trails he couldn't wait to conquer. In the back of Ron's, in the kitchen, was Ron's brother, Henry. Henry was standing over a desk, punching numbers from a packaging slip into a calculator. Before his big brother had died, he had made sure Henry knew the ins and outs of restaurant operations. "You could sell to the Morrisons, but what will you have to give your grandkids? Traffic on the 17 is only getting busier," Ron used to say. "Henry?" Diane, Henry's wife, was leaning against the door frame between the bar and the kitchen. "You look so much like him with those glasses on." The former biker babe with tan leather skin and a relatively trim figure for a woman in her early 60s walked slowly over to him. "Darling, if it weren't for Pete, I'd take these glasses right off and show you what makes me Henry." He winked and pulled her in close. "I'm not here," Pete laughed, flipping patties on the wide griddle before him. "What are you doing in my kitchen?" Henry squeezed his lady. "You asked me to tell you when Big Ed was here. Now don't squeeze too hard, you'll wrinkle my apron." "Did you ever think you'd be a waitress?" Henry kept squeezing. "I thought I was a hostess." She kissed his forehead and wiggled free. "Now, go see Big Ed. I know you want his royal star for Matthew." Diane was right. Henry had called Big Ed to discuss terms of the sale for his nephew's first bike. He scratched out on his notebook where he had left off on the orders, then followed Diane's perfume to the bar. It wasn't tough to spot Ed. He had earned his nickname more as a birthright rather than from labor. The man stood 6'8" and was a hulking 280 pounds. He had served as a Marine in Desert Storm, then come home to take care of his ailing grandfather. That's when Henry and Ron had met him. He's since become a staple in the community. Before he haggled with him, the bar and grill's new owner surveyed the scene. It was Thursday, later in the afternoon, and some of the booths had filled out. The bar had 4 folks watching TV, and Big Ed was playing pool with a local named Russ. Henry spotted a man sitting alone at a table near the bar. He recognized him, but he didn't know his name. That guy was an avid hiker up from Phoenix, and he was typically here with his dad. Henry figured he would have to go introduce himself again after his deal with Ed was concluded. Ron had always said that customer service meant customer loyalty, as well as just being the right thing to do in general. Henry took that to heart. He checked his watch. It was still early yet before the dinner rush. Kevin, another nephew, would be through the double doors soon to help wait tables tonight. It wasn't going to be too busy, so it was just him and Pete in the back of the house tonight, and Diane, Kevin, and a local girl named Julia back in town from college up north.
"Henry, a beer says I beat you in a round of pool."
Ed's deep voice beckoned as he finally noticed him. Russ was bobbing his head to the music. "Riding through your thunder to heaven and hell. A killer machine is the love that you need. You're living to ride, but you ride and die. Gamble to life on your last ride." Doc Holliday's Last Ride was playing overhead on the radio. You like losing, Ed? So tall that by the time your arms get the message from your brain to hit the ball, it's already moved. Russ roared with laughter.
How are you, brother?
Ed took Henry into a soul-squeezing embrace. I'll be better when you're not crushing my lungs, Henry coughed. The door opened, and as he was released from the hug, the owner of Rowdy Ron's turned, expecting to see his nephew. What he saw instead nearly dropped his jaw to the ground. An elderly woman with dark black hair stood there, her heavy-set body wrapped in a black trash bag like a poncho with holes for her wrinkled arms to protrude from. The restaurant quieted table by table until only the folks at the bar were chatting, but they too turned and fell silent when they saw Diane's bewildered expression. Henry stepped forward to speak, but stopped when the door opened again, and in stepped a stocky man who would be unassuming if it were not for his eyes, blacker than the hag's hair, and the scratches on his face. The door flapped shut behind the man with a thud-thud. The black-eyed man stood there as if a robot, stoic. His face was completely relaxed, as were his limbs. He was expressionless. Thud-thud. The door opened and shut again, as now a man resembling a high school principal entered. Thud-thud. A blonde, younger woman. Thud-thud. A horribly burned, middle-aged man. Thud-thud. Another burn victim. Henry gulped and wanted to speak, but the old woman wearing the trash bag poncho didn't want him to. She wasn't even looking at him, but Henry was back home with Ron. They were in trouble. Their grandmother had found their cigarettes, and they were in for a lecture. She was daring one of them to speak. She would slap whomever did first. Ron always spoke, though. He was the older brother, and he had always protected Henry. But Ron wasn't here. Oh my God. Diane was the first to speak, and only because of what happened next. Thud, thud. The door opened again, and a phantom entered. It was Ron. Ron was here, his skin devoid of color, where it was still intact. His Harley-Davidson leathers he had asked to be buried in were in good shape, but covered in dirt. Read. It was a command from the old woman. Ron stepped out from behind the group. With every step, there was a sickening crunching sound. Step, crunch, step, crunch. Those in the room cringed with each stride. Ron held a large book, Ainsley Harriet's Cajun Cooking Encyclopedia. He was now standing beside her, and he opened the book. Inside was not cooking narratives or recipes, but horrible symbols, ruins and images of the occult. Ron's mouth opened, and a bastardized version of the voice those he loved once knew came out. It wasn't English he spoke. It was something else, the language of the damned. Those in the group with weaker wills, the drug-addicted, the smokers, the gamblers, fell to their knees. It was about a third of them, falling in a deep bow. Their heads were shaking back and forth. Their mouths, if visible, were frothing spit. Those standing wanted to run, wanted to scream, but they couldn't, until the black-eyed statues by the door began screaming and running. Each honed in on a target and ran. Henry was helpless. "Ron," was all he could mutter, as the man with scratches on his face forced him to the ground. Henry was pulled by the collar to the old woman. "Henry!" Diane screamed, breaking a glass bottle on the bar as a burned woman vaulted the counter. The shattered glass edge found the assailant's gut, but the burned woman was unfazed, using her palms to batter Diane's face. Big Ed pulled a Glock 30, a handgun chambered in .45 ACP with a nearly 7-inch barrel. He squeezed off a shot into a man with black eyes. He didn't know it was Stephen, but Stephen collapsed as the thick round penetrated his torso. The molten lead cavitated the muscle and bone of his chest and exploded his left lung before ripping out his back and burrowing into a table. The gun had 10 more rounds, but its handle burned red hot. Ed yelled in pain, but gripped and fired again, taking a chunk of shoulder flesh off of a man dragging young Julia, kicking and screaming toward the old woman. The man dropped the gun, his hand, red and burned. The room was chaos. Ed could not nurse his hand like he wanted, because the man with the scratched face was charging him. Ed had fought before. Ed had even killed. This was different. The scratched man had no expression. His face gave away no thought. He was like a robot. His sole purpose to take Ed to the ground, and do what? Ed stepped to the side and punched his attacker in the face. It staggered the stoic man as he took the punch that normally knocked men out. He was turned about and coming toward Ed again. This time his jaw was red where he had been struck. Ed prepared to strike again, but was thrown off by a body hitting his back. Jim had a woman by the neck as she tugged and pulled, trying to remove his back from the wall and throw him to the ground. Beyond her crazed face, he saw the big biker, who was just playing pool minutes ago, taken down by 3 of the old woman's ghouls. Jim's free hand grabbed for anything on the table beside him, finding a glass bottle of ketchup. It was full. He battered the side of the woman's head until there was enough space. Then he lifted his leg and kicked out, sending her scattering across the floor. The accountant from Phoenix was now operating on instinct, his heart pounding. He grabbed a chair and sent it through the blacked-out window. He climbed out, careful to avoid the shards still stuck in the pane. Then was out in the open air and was running. He was not followed. He rounded a corner toward the front of the bar, and a Greyhound bus blocked the exit from the parking lot to the road. Inside sat a uniformed driver, his face relaxed and pale, his eyes black like the road he had spent his days traveling upon. Inside the bar, still, Ed struggled against the hands that grabbed his limbs, desperate to guard his face from the hail of palms. Every time he released a hand from the grip of one or two attackers to guard his face, he received kicks to the ribs. He had blood in his eyes, and he was unsure if it was his or someone else's, but it blurred his vision. His arm was grabbed again, and a rain of palms battered him. He was powerless then, as the number of hands gripping his limbs doubled. "No!" he screamed and thrashed, but the fight left him, as he saw that the hands battering him belonged to Diane. Henry was grabbing his leg then. The eyes of his friends were black, their pupils enlarged. "Do not resist." The hag was over him now. Ron stood beside her, with the book. "You will be my champion." She held a closed fist over Ed's face, and opened the fingers slowly. A tentacle of black bile crawled from her mouth and curled around her arm, splitting and spilling through her fingers and down onto Ed's face. "No, no!" Ed screamed, then garbled. Outside, 100 yards away, Jim ran along the I-17 as cars sped on as if nothing was going on. To them, this was another day. Jim began to slow. Then he heard the screams stop.